Thank you all so much for joining us for the third week of our hybrid seminar on the Black Jacobins by C.L.R. James. For those on the stream, welcome as well. You can't see how amazingly packed this room is. We did our little icebreaker before, so we're feeling some good fall vibes in the room as we get started. And we're looking forward to the conversation today on chapter 2 of the book, The Owners. But before I start, I want to respond to a really excellent question we had last week for folks that remember. I didn't answer it right away because I wanted to actually dig in a little bit more before I gave an answer. And it was a question about the role of voodoo in the Haitian Revolution, the best source, the best book on the sort of generalized role of voodoo in the Haitian Revolution. And I actually don't think there's a single great source, right? You see bits of it in Black Jacobins, you see bits of it in other histories of the Haitian Revolution in general. You also see some very interesting texts on, on the role of voodoo and conceptualizations of it more generally, I think, that are worth understanding. One is an edited volume. I'm just going to note these down so people can check them out. One called Voodoo in Haitian Life and Culture. It's a collected, volume that has a lot of great contributions. There's a book called The Spirits and the Law on the criminalization of voodoo practices. And we should definitely remember and mention the great Zora Neale Hurston, so American novelist and anthropologist who wrote very interesting and overlooked work on Haitian voodoo in Tell My Horse. Maybe it's possible that the best sort of narrow focus on the historical piece and the role of Haiti during the revolution is by the historian David Patrick Gegis, who's done several books on the Haitian Revolution. But in the volume Haitian Revolutionary Studies, there's a chapter that has a good sort of compact conceptualization of this question. And this is a question that's going to continue to be important, that we will talk about more in the future. And remember that when we're talking about voodoo, we're talking about several things, right? We're talking about a faith and a cosmology. We're also talking about a means of communication, which is incredibly important, right? A means of convoking people, inspiring them, leveraging cosmology, meaning a different version of the world and what the world could be to incite rebellion and struggle. And we're also crucially talking about something that was, at least in part, a syncretic, meaning a sort of fusion and a mixture, a syncretic faith that builds upon Haitian faith. I mean, that builds upon African faiths, right? That incorporates African faith into, a new vision. So something that's brought, something that arrives, something that doesn't appear simply out of nowhere. And that's something we've been digging into a lot already in these conversations, because one of the things that's really crucial when we're thinking about understanding the Haitian Revolution, and one of the pieces that C.L.R. James is not as good at grasping and documenting, is this other element of sort of pre-existing, maybe you could call it culture, political orientation, frameworks of struggle that are arriving with enslaved people, particularly the sort of African-born bosales, as they are called. So that's just to answer that one question before we get moving. And as we'll do in many of these sessions, when we begin, we'll do a bit of a recap about what it was that we talked about last week. For those that remember, we began by sort of sketching out a very basic understanding of the way that history progresses according to a very traditional Marxist understanding of dialectical materialism. And we did that in part to draw out, and for people that remember, I don't know where to go back to the slide. Oh yeah, this one right here. For people that remember, we were highlighting some of the limitations and of this framework for thinking through the Haitian struggle. We talked about it being grounded in a materialist analysis of European history in particular, and then kind of projected onto a global level, that there's a linearity to the understanding of moving through different modes of production in the same sequence that they emerged in European history. We talked about the way that there can be an economic determinism, meaning the economic forces are what drive history forward, as opposed to the political, cultural, and social forces of struggle, understanding, consciousness, again, things like voodoo, things like ways of understanding and looking at the world. And we also talk, very importantly, and this is what will be most important today, about the way that there's an implication that the forces that move history are what you could call endogenous or internal to, say, a nation state, right? So if we're talking about the French Revolution, one of the implications is feudalism has these contradictions. The contradictions are economic and they're political at the same time. They lead to a rupture and a moment of struggle in which the young bourgeoisie takes power in a revolution, the French Revolution. After having accumulated wealth, they make a seizure of power to then institute a capitalist system, right? That's a very French-based story, right? It occurs within the boundaries of France. That's one of the pieces that we're going to raise some questions about. We also looked at some of the parallels. Again, these are ongoing parallels that we have discussed between W.B. Du Bois' Black Reconstruction and the Black Jacobins. We looked at the tables of contents to see what they shared a great deal, and also maybe some of the things that set them apart. And we talked about the ways that both confronted what they call propaganda, right? Du Bois is confronting historical propaganda around what had congealed into a history of a US history that argued that there was very little struggle against slavery, that there were very few slave insurrections, that upheld this sort of myth of the happy slave and the beneficent master. And we saw the ways in which James was arguing some of those pieces as well in the first chapter on what he called the property. But there was something already there in the fact that he called it the property, whereas Du Bois calls his first chapter the white worker, right? And that's something James himself describes as him being sort of intuitively on the right track, showing that the property were a working class, were a class engaged in struggle, right? Eventually, but that Du Bois, rather than trying to show it, simply stated it, right? Simply acted as if it was true. So he saw Du Bois as being in some ways more advanced, and that's something that will come up a little bit today as well. We saw, of course, the fact that against this propaganda, resistance to slavery, rebellion, suicide, fire, poisoning, all forms of sabotage were constant, right? This is the great Maroon leader Macandal, who led a plot to poison all of the wells of the white population in San Domingo. And yet these are the kinds of struggles and forms of resistance that need to be erased to uphold the system, right? Of course, there was resistance, and against that resistance, there was brutal torture that was necessary to enforce a kind of docility, right? This is what James is documenting and showing, proving in a certain kind of way what Du Bois didn't need to prove, namely the fact that there was always resistance, that this was not a system that was accepted. And we saw last week as well, the way that the so-called property was not a single category, right? We saw distinctions of status, position, and function, specifically what he called a small and privileged caste among enslaved people who played certain roles within the system. But by virtue of playing those roles, he hinted, also tended to play an important role in resistance and revolution, right? They used the privilege of their position, Toussaint being one case in point, the privilege of their position to push forward and help to sort of organize and develop revolutionary movements. We also saw that one key distinction, and this is something that we will come back to today and in the future, one key distinction within the enslaved population of San Domingo was the fact that particularly by the sort of moment of the crisis of the system, two-thirds of the enslaved population was born in Africa, right? And we talked about how that quite logically means that they were more intransigent, more stubbornly free, less willing to accept the rules of this system, and more likely to fight against it, right? But I mean, just think, two-thirds of the entire population. Again, we'll come back to that a little bit in the course of this conversation today. And we talked about the way that the first chapter concluded in an interesting way, because it's talking about the need for leadership in a revolutionary struggle, the need for what they call a black Spartacus, a courageous chief, someone able to unify and lead enslaved people in Haiti. But then James very quickly pivots to saying that's not all that was necessary. That's not enough. Leadership is not enough without an opportunity to act, right? And he says, in this very, very interesting way, they could seize opportunity, but they could not create it. The creation of that opportunity, he suggests at the end of the chapter, comes through, and here we're taking kind of methodological cues. We're looking at how he's making this argument where he sees these dynamics emerging. He says it emerges from an equilibrium of the most powerful sectors of the globe that he suggests will then be breaking up, fragmenting, creating opportunities for those down below, right? We're talking about the freedom of Haiti, the abolition of slavery, but he showed us that, as he puts it, the possibility of emancipation did not begin with anyone who was interested in emancipation at all, right? It began with those who were the most opposed to it, right? Now, we saw in the course of this, and will continue to see in the way that James uses Marx, that, as we mentioned last week, he's doing and engaging in a kind of inductive mode of thought. In contrast to deductive, inductive means looking at the material. He's doing materialist analysis. He's looking at the data. He's looking at his contemporary, or not his contemporary, but he's looking at reality in the moment he's analyzing and allowing the categories that he needs to use to sort of map onto that reality in a nuanced way. He lets the reality determine the concepts. He doesn't let the concepts determine reality. He doesn't impose them in what we could call, it's a very, I love this metaphor. It's called in a very Procrustean way. Now, the Greek myth of Procrustes was this guy who you would go to stay in his hotel, and he has a bed that, if you're too tall, cuts off your head and your feet, and if you're too short, stretches you to fit the bed, right? So when we say Procrustean, we mean that using concepts in a way that does violence to that material reality in order to make it fit. That is the opposite of what James is doing. It's the opposite of what Walter Rodney does, what W.E.B. Du Bois, Amilcar Cabral, and so many others do, right? But it's very common for certain kinds of Marxist orthodoxy that tries to impose this framework of understanding onto the world. So there's something much more complex going on here. So when James does his materialist analysis of the origins of the Haitian Revolution, what does he find, and how does it map onto that trajectory we saw of Marx's understanding of dialectic materialism? First and foremost, he finds not individual countries with their own separate modes of production, right? Slavery, feudalism, capitalism, whose development is driven by internal dialectical forces, the accumulation of wealth, the grab for power that happens as a result of accumulating that wealth. We see instead something far more complex. We see a transatlantic and an even global framework for understanding capitalism as a single but internally complex global system. We see a system characterized by the simultaneous existence of many different relations of production, certainly, meaning the way that production is arranged, and possibly even different modes of production, depending on how we understand modes of production, or the fact that the idea of a single mode of production simply doesn't exist, doesn't make sense on a global level. And a system that, by virtue of the multiplicity of those forms, you've got the simultaneous existence of slavery, of capitalism, of feudalism, of collective life, indigenous life, all of these setting into motion a complex kind of quasi-dialectics that we might be tempted to even call something like multilectical, right? Not just two sides opposing and conflicting with each other and moving forward history. Again, this is the basic oversimplification of Marxist understanding. Feudal lords versus serfs, bourgeoisie versus proletariat, right? There are way more forces interacting in complex, chaotic, and contingent ways on a global level in this view, right? So we've already seen a few things begin to emerge in the chapter that we discussed last week, and they will become clearer this week. First, we saw the beginning of a partial sketch of a transnational class constellation that exists at the outset of both the French Revolution and the Haitian Revolution. They're happening at the same time and in an interlocking form, and which constitute part of a single revolutionary movement or process. And second, a suggestion of how and where the motion will begin, again, ironically, not from below, but with a conflict from above that creates opportunity, right? A struggle not about emancipation, but a conflict among those forces with no moral interest in emancipation at all. And again, this may not need to be said, but this is exactly what happens in the US Civil War. It's exactly what Du Bois shows. Neither the North nor the South wants to end slavery when the Civil War begins. That is not the goal of the war. That was not the objective of the war. It does become a war about slavery only because enslaved people make it that, right? And we're going to see something very, very similar play out here. Now here, as a result of that, we might want to hold in our heads a distinction between something like the beginning, saying, you know, what is the beginning of this process? What does it begin with? Because it begins with this clash from above. But beginning with is not the same as being the origin or the source, right? Beginning temporally, sort of, chronologically, is different from being source in a kind of, subterranean level. Because a beginning is a moment, a source is something more fundamental that is only revealed once things truly begin to move in earnest, and which is embodied again by those who can seize but cannot create. So we're talking about the owners today. Who are the owners? Let's turn to the first page. And again, James ended the first chapter with the three forces that will determine the beginning of this sequence. They are the planters in San Domingo, the French bourgeoisie, and the British bourgeoisie. In other words, globally powerful forces that existed and held a certain kind of equilibrium that will break down, as James suggests. Of the three, so this is him continuing on from the previous chapter, of the three San Domingo planters, British bourgeoisie and French bourgeoisie, the first and most important were the planters of San Domingo. Very interesting thing to say already, right? The most important will be this group of planters in the colony. Now, these planters constitute most of what I keep saying Du Bois, man. There's a reason for that, but I need to stop doing it. James, C-L-R. Nello, as his friends called him. The planters are most of what we understand by the owners. Most, but not all. Why? There are other elements of what we can understand to be the owner class. And we say class, why is it that James is not speaking of, say, the bourgeoisie or the landed aristocracy, or what is the name that he's giving? Like, why is the name that he's giving the owners instead, right? Bourgeoisie are owners, right? The bourgeoisie are defined as owners of the means of production under capitalism, who exploit labor in a certain kind of way. So here we're talking about owners, right? People that own land. Speaking of the planter is more precise than the owners because you are talking about the specific owning of the land. But when it comes to means of production, in other words, the things we need to produce, we aren't only talking about land. So he's saying the owners in part because we're also talking about the other things that the planters own. In other words, we're talking about the human beings that are being owned. And once we understand that it's not simply about the land, we know that the owners is far bigger than simply the planters because other people owned people, right? Not just the large landowners. And it wasn't only white people who owned slaves in this context. Now we're going to ask a question that we ask often that has a couple of different valences. But when we say who are the planters, we're saying who are they and why does it matter who they are? Maybe that seems like a complicated way to put the question, but we're talking about both concretely who they are and about their character. What makes them who they are and what who they are makes them, if that makes sense. Like Du Bois, James interprets Marxism as not reducing character to function, right? Your character is not the direct mechanical result of the function that you play, or seeing that as unimportant, seeing character as unimportant, but instead he sees it as a crucial factor that has autonomy, but also is rooted in economic structure. Recall the spiraling logic that says, we make history, but we're made by history, but we make history, but we're made by history, right? How do we understand that spiral? How did history make the owners? And more specifically, how did history make the planters? So we're still on page 27. We're actually on the very next line. On such a soil as San Domingo slavery, only a vicious society could flourish. He doesn't say soil as San Domingo. He says soil as San Domingo slavery. He's talking about the economic system is the soil. What kind of society could flourish on top of that soil? Only a vicious society. Slavery in this context creates a vicious and demoralized, literally demoralized people, according to James. And recall here that vicious means full of vice. You know, we use vicious as if it's not anchored in a historical understanding of the fact that it's describing the prevalence of vice. A vicious society is a society full of vices, and he describes in indulgent detail all of the vices that exist in the society. He'd already described some of them, of course, in the previous chapter when he talks about violence, when he talks about torture. This viciousness is the outgrowth of the indulgence of slavery, as he puts it, and what he calls the isolation of the countryside. Like many settler elites, the planters in San Domingo have a permanent inferiority complex. They don't really want to be there, right? France is where they want to be. Ultimately, they want to put together enough money to go live in France, to retire to France. Many even left their plantations in the hands of managers so they could just go live in Paris and collect the money, right? And it's really important to understand that this is not a class that wants to work or accumulate in toward any specific end, right? This is a society that wants to consume. The planters, and in some senses the owners more broadly, are a decadent class, according to James, which is both, again, a description of what they are and a description of what they're doing as a process, by which I mean they're self-indulgent, they are lazy. That is what it means to be decadent. And to be decadent also means they're engaged in a process of decline. They are on the downswing of human civilization. That's what decadence refers to in this context. And the question is a decline from what? James goes on, he says that they had lost the austerity of their founders. Again, very similar to the US, where you've got not only a distinction between early settlers and then the sort of like full-blown slave system in the US South, but also a distinction between the kind of hard-nosed capitalists in the North and the kind of culture that emerges in the South, which is very much one of aristocratic consumers. And we'll come back to this piece in a second. He says normally the existence of cities where people come together in these sort of more cosmopolitan ways are a sort of vaccination against this kind of what he calls savagery, and he's being very clear in the inversion he's doing here, right? Like, this is not civilization, this is savagery. Even the existence of towns, cities where people live together was not enough. Even the church, as he puts it, was not enough to contain this degeneracy. Now, unsurprisingly, this kind of moral, cultural, ethical, spiritual decline is incredibly common among slave societies. And we're not talking it's not like immorality as a kind of judgment, right, based on the immorality of the system. That much is true. We're talking about the actual decline in the character of people because of the system that they live and engage in, right? So something a little more, a little deeper, right? The laziness it creates, the indulgence, the apathy. Although there's a different position here we should understand when it comes to modern slavery, where there's slavery that is kind of emerging out of and in conjunction with capitalism, which then, the process of decline is then from capitalism back toward a kind of degeneracy fed by slavery. But we can talk more about that. It's a bit more of maybe a nuanced point. Here, when we're thinking about the effect and the impact of slavery on sort of consciousness, on one's own character, a really important reference point for many in the dialectical tradition in particular is, of course, Hegel's famous master-slave dialectic. For those that don't give a shit about this, I feel you. It'll just be a minute, and then we can go back to talking about things that aren't Hegel-related. But this is a text that becomes incredibly crucial, not only for Marx and Marxism, but also for Fanon, for many anti-colonial thinkers, because it sought to identify and drive home the importance of struggle for the development of consciousness, right? When you look at someone like Fanon, who's saying, no, listen, struggle against colonialism is a huge step in the development of national consciousness among colonized people, right? He is basing that on a certain kind of reading of the way that Hegel frames this master-slave dialectic. And what Hegel tries to show in this master-slave dialectic, very, very briefly, is the ways in which there's an inversion that happens in human consciousness, human consciousness, when something like a slave system exists, right? Picture what this involves. It involves a struggle to establish that system. Those who are apparently sovereign, autonomous, powerful individuals who are victorious become the masters. Those who are apparently weaker, they lose the struggle. They are enslaved in the process of this, and they enter into a process that is geared toward production on a slave basis. And what does that mean for Hegel? It means that over time, the relationship inverts. Over time, the master becomes less and less independent. Over time, the master is not engaging in production, is not engaging with the world, is not externalizing, is the sort of like maybe technical language, externalizing their own consciousness through creative activity in that world, right? Who is the enslaved person, right? So for Hegel, there's this inversion where the enslaved person, by working on the world, by doing that actual labor, by creating and building, is the person who develops a level of sovereignty and autonomy, right? So it's a sort of counterintuitive argument that can easily be read, although Hegel doesn't say this part, can easily be read as ultimately leading to a slave rebellion that flips that order over again. Many people read it that way. Hegel doesn't write it that way. So the master loses contact with reality and therefore loses their own consciousness and autonomy. The slave develops consciousness through that labor and through that struggle, right? Again, this is clear in many slave societies. It's clear in the US context too, where despite the centrality of slavery in global capitalism, Southern society was not characterized by, say, hardworking owners seeking to accumulate wealth for its own sake, which is the capitalist vision, right? It's instead characterized by a lazy and decadent master class that produces in order to consume, conspicuous consumption, right? Producing to consume rather than consuming to produce. These are very, very different visions. And for Marx or other sort of Marxists, this is more of a feudal relation than a capitalist circuit, right? Okay, so what's very interesting about this is the fact that when we see this moral decline into viciousness happening in Haiti around the time of the revolution, some of which we already saw playing out again in the previous chapter on property, we aren't simply seeing an example of the kind of European dialectical thought that Hegel and Marx are developing. Because the reality is that in many ways we're seeing the origin. When Hegel wrote this piece, it's in the early 1800s, at the turn of the 18th century. He knows all about the Haitian Revolution. He's reading about the Haitian Revolution all the time. Susan Buck Morse very famously wrote this piece called Hegel in Haiti, saying that he writes this whole sort of text about slavery and the struggle against slavery and the effect of slavery and the effect on consciousness, and he doesn't mention the fact that he's watching in real time a real slave revolution happen. And we know that he is. We know that he's reading about it. So he didn't admit it, but he wrote it with Haiti in mind. The absolute moral and economic decadence of the slave system was all around Hegel at the turn of the 18th century, and the San Domingo elites were providing him ample evidence to draw upon. This is where James begins to map out who the owners are. And this is his materialist mapping of the class structure in San Domingo. He begun with the mapping of the property, the different fragmentations of what fall under property. Here he's doing this same, sort of engaging the same process on the side of the owners, right? He starts with the fact that, that all is over toward page 33. All whites were white, meaning first and foremost that they were free and, as he puts it, a person of quality. This becomes important. Not all free people, however, were white, and certainly not all whites were the same. Things are getting complicated already. The first major distinction that James draws out is between what he calls big whites and small whites. Again, ask ourselves, why is he choosing these categories and not more traditional kind of Marxist categories? Who are the big whites? The big whites are roughly the maritime bourgeoisie, meaning those involved in the shipping there on the island, and the planters, right? So those who are running the plantations and those who are transporting those goods abroad. Those are the big whites. It's I forget the actual numbers. It's a relatively small class on the island. Who are the small whites? Again, what we could roughly call the petty bourgeoisie, the small petty capitalists, sure, but also, he says, a lot more fit into this category of small whites. Vagabonds, fugitives, adventurers, a non-economically productive rabble. He says, quote, men of all crimes and all nationalities. And they're there in part because this is the only place that they could be someone by virtue of their race, if that makes sense. Again, everyone who was white was a person of quality. These are people who were not considered people of quality in France. And so here they found a place where their status mattered. And he notes in a very interesting footnote on the bottom of 33, which I believe is gleaned, if not from Du Bois, it could have been gleaned from Du Bois. This should not be confused with the modern poor whites in America or South Africa. Some of these, especially in America, live at a standard almost as low as that of the Negroes in their community. So it's a little different from what Du Bois calls the poor whites of the US South, who Du Bois said lived in absolute squalor, absolute filth. That's not what James is describing here. These are still a very low economic class, but their level of superiority in a context of what we'll see is a society in which the vast majority of people are enslaved creates a different framework, right? No one, as James puts it, no one would do work that they could have an enslaved person do for them. Right? Very, very different situation. Now, for the small whites, in a psychological reaction that we are more than familiar with in the United States, this is the top of page 34. For these small whites, race was everything. Again, it was their status, it was their guarantee of quality. This was the type, this is the very top of page 34, this was the type for whom race prejudice was more important than even the possession of slaves, of which they held few. Some though, some but few. The distinction between a white man and a man of color was for them fundamental. It was their all. In defense of it, they would bring down the whole of their world. Right? Again, I say we're very familiar with it because it's this apparent paradox, but it makes perfect sense, right? Which is that if you don't have shit, then whatever you have is incredibly valuable, right? As the economic class of white people go down in American society as well, the need to cling to something like white supremacy and white superiority increases. Right? That is what James is also identifying here. Race was everything, it was their all. Between the big whites and the small whites, James identifies what he calls the first great division. Think of dialectics, think of dynamic oppositions, right? Conflict. The first great division, and as he puts it, they will spring at each other and fight to a finish once they have the opportunity. Small whites against the big whites. Again, I'm putting the totals up here so we get an understanding of the sort of size of the groups involved. Roughly 30,000 between the two. I think the big whites is a very small number, maybe 1,000, I'm not sure. The next white class that James identifies in his mapping of this class constellation is the bureaucracy. This is the class of French government officials, French government representatives who are sent from France to help govern, right? They're the direct representatives of the French crown and the French government. They represented the crown and the bourgeoisie in ways that become very complicated. And they derived their absolute authority in the colony from this to an ironic degree. It kind of cuts both ways. As James writes, their arbitrariness had no legal bounds. God was too high and the king too far, meaning they could do anything they wanted, right? This is very common in the Western Hemisphere. The conquistadors, the colonizers are so far from their royal sort of bosses that they essentially can act however they want, and they can act with utter arbitrariness. The flip side of this in this specific context, meaning San Domingo, the key to that context being the demographic, the sort of demographic structure, the very small number of whites in the colony. The way that this cuts the other way is that there were so few and so far from the king that they couldn't rely purely on that authority, and they had to engage in what we will see to be a process of winning allies, bringing certain groups to their side. So we've already got three classes of whites: big whites, small whites, and the bureaucracy. And we're just getting started. There was another free class. This is James writing. There was another free class. And it's very interesting because we're in the chapter on the owners, and yet he is saved for this chapter the class of mixed race free people and free black people, right? Why? Because they're also owners. He's divided the chapters in a way that he's not talking about racial distinctions per se, but he's talking about relations to the forms of ownership that exist, right? So he turns now to the mixed race people, what he calls, according to the historical language, of course, mulattoes, and to also free black people, who he'll speak less about, but in certain moments will become important. He says, it's very interesting, he says race privilege was not originally very strong. And the privileges that had been granted to mixed race people initially were not to, the goal was not to push them away from the governing elites, but to pull them in, right, to make them allies of this bureaucracy. This is why they enjoyed certain privileges, and also because they ended up being a very powerful sector. Again, why is this the case? Because unlike the US South, which had a majority white population, a slim majority, but a majority of the population was white, Du Bois says those poor whites could serve as the police to control the entire enslaved population. That is not the case in San Domingo. This is a huge difference. There are 500,000 enslaved people, right? Compared to 30,000 white people. That's a huge difference. 90% of the population is enslaved, and 2/3 of them are African born. Now, here on page 37, James refers to and describes mixed race people, mulattoes, with a term that will be incredibly important to understand their function and political position and orientation. He calls them intermediates. They're in between. The question is going to be, what are they in between? They had previously been something of equals to poor whites in particular, or small whites, but as they gained in numbers and power, and remember that these people are literally, quite literally, the product of enslavement and race mixing as a result of enslavement. They're produced by the slave owners in a literal way. As they grew in population, though, poor whites, small whites began to get a little hesitant, right? They began to restrict them, harass them. They tried to even enslave some at certain points, and they forced them into special kind of patrols that were used to police, Maroons and other rebellious communities. Why does James, in other words, include mixed race people and free blacks in the chapter on the owners? Because they could still own property, which would prove key, although in contradictory ways, as we see it playing out. And that property included enslaved people, right? So mixed race people, free black people could own slaves, right? One of the central stories that James is trying to tell throughout Black Jacobins is the story of what he calls race prejudice, not as a permanent or fixed thing, but as a dynamic. So he's tracking the emergence of racial categories and trying to pin down the historical mechanisms whereby they gain or lose force, which factors lead to the advance or retreat of what he calls race thinking. And here we have one of those moments, right? As mulattoes accumulated wealth, what he calls, and this is a quote, jealousy and envy among poor whites becomes hatred and fear. There's a shift from jealousy to hatred, envy to fear. And this leads to new restrictions. So there's a pushback against this ostensible equality that had existed. The colonists established what he describes as, and this is, where is this? Over on page 38. This is a quote from James. He calls it the elaborate tomfoolery of this sort of complex racial categorization. It's kind of like the Mexican caste paintings, but far more elaborate. There are 128 categories of racial mixture. But the punchline of all 128 was the same in this case, that they were all colored, in other words, all non-white. James notes it's very interesting that in France at the same exact time, there was far less race prejudice and sort of opposition, particularly to mixed race people. But as a consequence of this pushback, just to be clear, you could be one out of 128th, 128th black, and still be considered a mixed race person and therefore not white. This is how certain sectors of the small whites are trying to redraw these racial lines. Now, after mentioning the emergence of race prejudice and the establishment of this elaborate racial hierarchy, James says something that seems very strange, if not completely contradictory to what he's just said. He says, this is on the bottom of 38. He said, this has nothing to do with the race question. Bizarre. He's just described the racial categorization, but then follows it by saying this has nothing to do with the race question. What could this possibly mean? For James, it means that we're talking about a material relationship defined by status. And what looms in the background of this, and again, recall that this is a clash between white population and mixed race population. What looms behind this is the status of enslaved people and the fear of slaves. This gains a racial aspect, of course. It's grounded in a racial aspect. But what it here means is that mixed people had parents, grandparents, great-grandparents who were enslaved, right? They had a contact with slavery. They had a familiarity on some level with it. And this boundary, therefore, became a dangerous one that had to be policed, as James puts it, by bullets and bayonets, even as free black people, mixed race people, were accumulating a level of wealth that contradicted their political status. In a classic Marxist fashion, but of course pushed beyond the boundaries of what Marxism would actually be used to describe often, the mixed race people, the so-called mulattoes, in James' words, began to press against the barriers that oppressed them. This is exactly the story that Marx tells about the bourgeoisie in France, right? They're accumulating wealth. They have no political rights because France is under the control of an absolute monarchy. So you're rich, you have a bunch of resources, a bunch of wealth. You use that wealth, of course, to start a revolution, to overthrow that political structure. So he's doing and he's showing some of the same forces, but mapping them onto very, very different terrain in the context of San Domingo. There's a parallel already building here between the young bourgeoisie in France and the mixed race mulattoes in San Domingo. And that's a parallel that James will continue throughout. Both are intermediary classes, both are unstable, both are not at the top or the bottom of the struggles that will unfold. It wasn't only the white colonists who feared the slaves either. And here on page 39, on page 43 actually. James writes, race prejudice against the Negroes permeated the minds of the mulattoes who so bitterly resented the same thing from the whites. Black slaves and mulattoes hated each other, to which James adds in sort of very florid prose, he adds, it all reads like a cross between a nightmare and a bad joke. Racial distinctions are being, racial distinctions around questions of status are being imposed, and they create a division among and between enslaved people here and mixed race people here that he describes as a level of hatred. All of these categories are in motion. All of them will begin to move, and they will move for reasons that don't have anything to do with morals, ethics, high-minded sort of like philosophies, and that actually for James don't have as much to do with racial prejudice either. They have to do with material necessities of struggle. As he puts it at the top of 44, it took gunpowder and cold steel to convince the San Domingo whites to change their view. And further down onto page 44, he says, once the revolution was well underway, the big whites, in other words, this group right here, would have to choose between their allies of race and their allies of property. They would not hesitate long. And maybe we have assumptions about where that decision goes, but it might go in the opposite direction of what you're thinking. Just spoiler alert. Now, before we take a couple of questions, I do want to just move on to a glimpse of what we're now seeing coming into being as a transnational class constellation that James is mapping. Again, he's doing a materialist analysis in San Domingo. He's not simply applying in a mechanical fashion Marxist categories. He's looking at the material, the reality, and determining what categories describe what's happening in the best way. It's still a class analysis, right? It's just not one that's sort of mechanically imposed in a Procrustean way. So here's the transnational constellation. What are the connections and relations binding the two sides of the ocean together? That's going to be the next question we turn to. But before we do that, I'll say just a couple things, right? We've got San Domingo on this side, France on the other side. We've seen big whites, small whites, mulattoes, and free blacks. They're not exactly the same category, but they exist in an intermediate position. And black slaves / masses. This is going to be a descriptive term that he uses. On the French side, we have the more traditional categorization, but these are parallels. It's important to understand these are parallels. He's describing these categories as explicit parallels, although the way that they will interact with each other is not mechanical either. The monarchy on the top, the aristocracy and the nobility, second down on the list, the bourgeoisie, and MB stands for maritime bourgeoisie, which is something we'll talk about in a couple of minutes, and then the French masses. The parallels exist across each of these levels. These are parallels of political positioning, function, that condition and shape behavior but don't determine it. And of course, in between, we have the bureaucracy floating as a representative of the two. Now, the parallels, and I just want to maybe emphasize this, and we'll take some questions. Just because there are parallels doesn't mean that this isn't a story that for James is driven by, again, this kind of radically dynamic, chaotic, contingent pinballing of forces back and forth. Again, if dialectics means two, this is not what we're talking about. We're talking about a whole bunch of shit happening at once and rebounding back and forth across the ocean. That's going to be the way that this unfolds. Does that make sense? Cool. Let's take a couple questions and then we will finish up our conversation.
So I had a question just for clarification about a sentence on the top of page 44 in context to the dynamics of colorism and wealth and how that created the class system in the colony. But the sentence was, and if, as we have seen, the most intelligent of them did not delude themselves about the materialist origins of their prejudice against the mulattoes, we yet will make a great mistake if we think that they were hypocrites when they claimed that a white skin guaranteed to the owner superior abilities and entitled him to a monopoly of the best that the colony afforded. I was just wondering, again, in context of that dynamic, what did James mean by that sentence?
Yeah, it's a complicated sentence, right? And he's trying to speak to the sort of the simultaneity of, what he's saying is both of these things are true, right? He's saying they were not mistaken, meaning the most intelligent of the San Domingo whites, more likely those who are richer, they did not delude themselves about the materialist origins of their prejudice, right? Meaning they knew that they hated people of color because they were scared of their wealth, because they were competitors, because they saw the position and the status and the accumulation of that property as a threat to them, right? So they knew that, he's saying. On the other hand, he's saying, it doesn't mean that they were hypocrites to say that whites can guarantee the owner superior abilities and entitled him to a monopoly of the best the colony afforded. He's saying it was a material reality though, right? In other words, what he's saying in a nutshell is what we often say, which is that race is a social construct and a material reality, right? Just because it's a construct, and it seems very obvious, but there's a lot of ways in theorization and in political action that this, that people sort of weight this in the wrong way, right? That leads to bad outcomes. Simply the fact that race is a made up, invented idea that doesn't exist doesn't mean that it doesn't become a reality once it exists, right? That it doesn't have very real material consequences. He's saying these people knew that they were racist because of economics, and yet they knew that being white in a racist society meant that they could benefit from that white supremacy, if that makes sense. And that it was a tool, and it's a tool they used whenever they could. We're also going to see the ways that the tool, there's moments where economic interests trump racial interests, right? And this is something that James is going to identify as the way that historical progress actually happens. Yeah. I think we maybe have we have such a full house today, it's amazing.
Thank you. Just want to make sure I'm on the right page that I was looking at. So I was noticing a lot of parallels in this chapter with the current political climate. And there was, on page 36, they talked about the insurrection that broke out on the island led by the local justices of the peace, lawyers, notaries, and prosecutors. And I was just wondering if you were able to elaborate on that a little bit. And I mean, obviously what kind of comes to mind for me is the insurrection, that took place a couple years ago in the Capitol, and wondering if you can elaborate on any of the parallels there.
Yeah, it's on 36, you said?
Yeah,
oh, yeah.
top
Insurrection
36.
broke out, led by the local justices of the peace, lawyers, notaries, prosecutors. The planters complained that the supporters were among the lowest sectors of the population. They even had some quasi-national / racial frames that they were using about. There's different pieces happening here. There is the question that I think you're sort of honing in on, which is who is the basis of, if I'm reading it all the way, like who is the basis of fascism and Trumpism? There's that, yes, right? It's not, the big whites will be racist when they need to be, but the big whites, again, are the ones who are less attached to whiteness as a frame because they have their wealth, right? Their wealth is their guarantee. Small whites don't have that. The further you get down into that sort of middling sector, the more you have the emergence of certain forces. I'm not sure that's necessarily the defining piece here because there's a lot of different dynamics playing out constantly, right? There are struggles against, we haven't brought this up yet, the so-called exclusive, right? The requirement that all shipping and trade go directly to France. This is something that will become a point of debate. But prior to that, we're talking about the ongoing war, quasi-war between big whites and small whites, which takes a whole bunch of different forms. Again, roughly speaking, the bureaucrats, to keep order, ally themselves with the small whites against the big whites. And so that tense triangle is a lot of what sort of like sets off these little pieces up until the moment when the revolution begins to break out. And then we'll see how other sectors get brought into these alliances. First mixed race people and then enslaved people. Makes sense? Yeah.
Okay. There's a question in the chat right now that we're getting, which is, where does Eric Williams' analysis fit in between Du Bois and James in regards to everything that's happening right now? And then there's also like another question, which I got to do them because they're both kind of not similar, but just two questions. Besides voodoo, what about the influence of like the Pirates of the Caribbean on like just James's ideology and things like that?
The movie or the practice?
Reality.
The Pirates of the Caribbean, yes. So the first thing to say is that Eric Williams is James' secretary, right? He's a younger generation from Trinidad, worked very closely with James, worked very closely with him in London, actually ended up going to a lot of the archives in Paris that helped to lead to Black Jacobins being written. Eric Williams is doing a lot of this work, right? And what he produces in terms of analysis is very, very similar, right? A slightly more systematic analysis that isn't grounded in a specific historical revolutionary moment, but a broader understanding of what he titles very, very simply capitalism and slavery, right? How do the two fit together? And so Eric Williams is central to this sort of prehistory of, or actual history of what we call racial capitalism, right? The ways that slavery is at the heart of global capitalism as a force. Interesting story is that then they fall out, right? They fall out over concrete political questions. James actually ends up under house arrest in Trinidad at a certain point when Williams is prime minister. So we're talking about very complex dynamics in political reality. The question of the different, piracy is a key question here. It will pop up in the story, but it won't be as central as, say, the shifting alliances between colonial forces, right? And we don't want to like read piracy as piracy necessarily, when piracy is often the British empowering private actors to engage in vigilante war, for example, right? So you've got, and you'll see in a couple of chapters, Spanish, English entering the fray, right? Remember, this is on San Domingo. We're talking about the island of what's often called Hispaniola, an island that today is both Haiti and the Dominican Republic, and that has Spanish colonizers also on it, right? So the Spanish are there, the English will try to make a play, and we'll see even before the end of this chapter the way that those forces begin to clash. What else? Do we have any more in the chat, or are we good for now? Keep going? All right, I love it. These are great questions though. Oh, we got Sterling.
Yeah, I feel like I'm just interested in maybe the response to it, but I do feel like there are slight differences in the description of the owners and the towns and the debauchery, all their lives, and compared to maybe what's happening in the South during that time. They seem very similar, but it's also a little. There's something about like being away from the metropole that says that like this is where you do all the dirty things that you couldn't do at home. That that is kind of, I don't know. It's like, I don't know. It's like temple students, stuff like, it's like what happens in the current life, It's like, but it means it's like the place, the colony is that like, things happen. This is where, I'm just interested in, even when they were talking about the clergy, there was like the clergy, you think they'd be a moderating force, but no, they were the most exploitative. And just thinking about, I guess, those differences and I don't know if you ever thought about them, but I just, at least I keep thinking about how the colony space, the place of the colony, and also the towns on the frontier are also where, I don't know, at least in the colonizer mind, that like they're able to do the most exploitation, the nastiest things possible. So anyway, I'm just wondering.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. It opens up onto actually huge, other really, really huge questions, right? So part of what you're saying is, what is like, there seems to be a bit of maybe a difference between the US South and something like San Domingo in terms of the culture of viciousness that slavery, creates. Yes, I think that's true. At the same time, that viciousness is there in the US South, right? It's a system that is built on mass systematic sexual assault, right? And in which that is part of the formation of a certain kind of identity. It is closer to the metropole, right? The US has this funny way of being, it's not Europe, but it's developing into an industrial power, so it's closer to the metropole at this point is northern capitalism, right? So particularly in the traditional South, right, Virginia, South Carolina, the decadence is really, it's still decadence, but it's a very wealthy decadence, right? You've got your debutante balls, you've got your elaborate rituals of sort of feudal status, right? Again, it's very decadent culture, but it's very different from the colonial space that we're talking about here, where multiple things are happening, one of which is exactly what you identify. The great Argentine-Mexican philosopher Enrique Dussel had this really important framing of what he called, in response to the ego cogito. This is the sort of, René Descartes, the founding of modern philosophy is built on this idea of I think, therefore I am, the thinking ego, the ego cogito. And Dussel said, before that, centuries before that, you had the ego conquito, right, the conquering ego. This gets to the piece that James had mentioned, right? The bureaucrats were so far away from the French monarchy that they could do whatever they wanted, right? Before that, the Spanish conquistadors could do whatever they wanted, right? And so they're engaging in some of the most brutal violence on all levels and of all scopes, right? Far beyond anything that the king and queen would have permitted. And there are multiple attempts in Europe to outlaw the kind of behavior that's happening. He even talks about some when it comes to the black codes and other things. But he also shows that a century later, the same shit is still happening, because there's no actual way to stop the colonial elites who have a different kind of consciousness, what ends up being a more fascistically colonial consciousness. I mentioned last time, like the Pieds Noirs in Algeria, the settlers are the ones who are invested in the system, and they're invested in that part of it, right? The other, and the last piece that I'll add is that one important element for like understanding how colonialism operates in global history is to understand that it's emerging simultaneous to the emergence of many things that we take for granted. Meaning, and Foucault, like if you look at Foucault's work, he sort of like goes through all these things, right? The history of sexuality, the emergence of certain norms around sexuality coincide with the emergence and creation of a criminalized sort of abnormal sexual class, right? You get the one by the other, right? In other words, Europe's sexual identity develops through the criminalization of homosexuality and other forms, right? The Enlightenment is a time of the emergence of the rational, sovereign, individual, right? That emerges at the same time as the invention of madness and the creation of an institution, the asylum, to contain that madness, right? So these things are happening simultaneously, and for someone like Foucault, you have to have the two sides, right? The same thing, and this just really sort of circles back to what you were saying, European patriarchy does not predate this. It's being developed at the same time, meaning the ideas about what this European man should be in reference to his wife, to his children, to their family unit, to their sort of property and wealth. And the outside, right, the radical, barbaric outside to that is the colonies, right, where you can do whatever you want. So those two, you know what I mean? You form that identity of what patriarchy should be and needs to be at the same time that you're unleashing mass sexual violence as well. So the two, that's to say that they're what are often referred to as like a constitutive outside, right? The thing on the outside is helping to define and cohere the thing on the inside, and that happens across lots of different sectors. So I think that's a really good point. Oh, we got another one. Amazing.
Hey, so my question here stems from page 38, that middle paragraph, the last sentence, but the song Melee with 127 white parts. That sentence reminds me of the one drop rule. And much of this chapter reminds me of the Willie Lynch letter. Now, whether that speech actually happened or not is somewhat irrelevant. What I'm wondering is the racial formations that are described in this chapter, how universalizable, how much can it help us understand, let's say, Louisiana or Brazil, or is this so like endogenous to this particular isolated place that it's its own unique thing?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's not universalizable, right? It's not that it's a specific, it's not that it's this one place. It's that this is what happens to race everywhere. It emerges according to its own dynamics. It takes very different formulations. And so you've got the Sang Melee, who is 1 part black to 127 parts white. In other words, someone who by any sort of like visual test, right, would appear to be completely white, is under this categorization defined as non-white. And I speak carefully because it's not the one drop rule. That person is not defined as black. That person is not enslavable, right? That's one of the clear distinctions, right? What we're talking about is the reinforcement of a racial categorization to distinguish mixed people from white people. But those people in this context are still distinguished from enslaved people, right? Which itself shifts over time, right? It's not, it's not that it was only ever 100% black Africans who were enslaved, but that line is being drawn, and this line is being drawn around mixed race people. So what you've got is the institutionalization through this racial, this reemergence of racial logics of a more tripartite system, right? And that's very different from the one drop rule, which is binary, right? So, so you do have it emerging in very different ways, and that's going to be incredibly crucial. These are not people who, the fact that mixed race people in this context are not enslavable has a huge amount to say about how they will act politically, who they identify with politically, where their loyalties are, the kind of privileges they will claim for themselves, exactly why James calls them an intermediary class, if that makes sense. Yeah, that's a great question, though. Cool. Now, we have the transnational class constellation that James establishes, the mapping. He didn't really map too much the French side. It's more of a traditional story. We mentioned a little bit the fact that he's building on top of, let's go back for a second, sort of more radical emerging histories of the French Revolution that are not simply bourgeoisie versus monarchy, but more complicated with the masses already there. He's reading French social history that's emerging that centers the role of the masses. So he's not coming up with all of that, but he is mapping it out. And as he brings this transnational constellation together and begins to sort of set it into motion. He maps it out and then sets it into motion. That's what Du Bois does. That's what many sort of revolutionary third world Marxists do, right? They look around them, map out the structure, and then begin to set the structure into motion. And when he begins to ask the question of how do these pieces connect with each other, how do they relate to each other in that transnational dynamic, he turns very directly to the economic question. In other words, in his words, what San Domingo means, what it meant at the outset of the French Revolution, what it meant at the outset of the Haitian Revolution. And in the process, he gives us a very concise lesson in, again, what we call racial capitalism, or the centrality of the question of slavery to the history of capitalism. James, side note, probably not want to call it racial capitalism, call it slavery in capitalism as a sort of historical sort of phenomenon. But the frame that we often use, racial capitalism, is one that you see very clearly here. If you look at page 45, he says, prosperity is not a moral question, and the justification of San Domingo was its prosperity. Never for centuries had the Western world known such economic progress. He goes through the numbers. He lays out the wealth that is being accumulated, extracted in this colony. He says, never, this is over on 46, if on no earthly spot was so much misery concentrated as on a slave ship, then on no portion of the globe did its surface in proportion to its dimensions yield so much wealth as the colony of San Domingo. The next line, and yet it was this very prosperity which would lead to the revolution. It was the prosperity that leads to the revolution. Kind of counterintuitive, right? We don't necessarily think of prosperity leading to revolutions, but that's a very Marxist thing to say. It's the pressures that the extraction and accumulation of wealth builds up that leads to this revolution that sends history moving forward. And he puts it even more clearly, it keeps getting clearer and clearer, over on page 47. Long before 1789, the French bourgeoisie was the most powerful economic force in France. Again, the royalty is still in power. The bourgeoisie is the most powerful economic force in France. That's the classic story. It becomes not a classic story with what he adds, right? The bourgeoisie is the most powerful economic force in France, and the slave trade and the colonies were the basis of its wealth and power. Again, let's go back. The classic story is that the wealth is accumulating within within France. The bourgeoisie then makes a bid for power. The wealth is coming from outside of the country, first and foremost. Secondly, it's coming from a mode of production or a form of production, so-called slavery, right? That Marxism often takes to be a sort of historical form that predates feudalism by often centuries, if not millennia. So you're seeing a disruption of this understanding of the trajectory and of the source. The wealth is not emerging within France that is setting off this dialectical explosion that is the French Revolution. The wealth comes from the outside. It comes from slavery. It comes from capitalism. The wealthiest colony on earth is San Domingo. That wealth is the basis of the French Revolution and the Haitian Revolution. So you've got clearly the bourgeoisie accumulating power, and you've got the bourgeoisie engaging in what will be a struggle for dominance in the French Revolution. But he specifies very quickly, and this is why I mentioned, you'll start to notice over in, on page 49 and beyond, he doesn't just talk about the bourgeoisie, he talks about the maritime bourgeoisie. He's talking about the bourgeoisie located in certain cities. In Nantes, in Bordeaux, in Marseille, the wealth they're accumulating is not from the exploitation of laborers in France, in factories, say. It's emerging from the hyper-exploitation in San Domingo. The source, in other words, is elsewhere, outside of the nation of France, outside of what's often understood to be the dialectical frame for that revolutionary change. Now, even where Marx turns to centering, or not centering, that's too strong, focusing on discussing the role of slavery in colonialism, so we're talking about the later parts of Capital Volume 1. This is Marx writing toward the middle to end of his life. And this is in a discussion on what he calls so-called primitive accumulation. Even there, he's seeing slavery and colonialism as accelerating the emergence of capitalism, right? Speeding it up, setting it into motion, making it a global system quicker than it would have otherwise. And this is true. It's certainly an accelerant, but it's much more than an accelerant. He's not really fully granting slavery and colonialism the centrality and the power as a driving force of global history that James is showing, and that other third world Marxists will also show. Not only was slavery central to global capitalism, but intra-capitalist competition on the global level will also be key to the abolition of the slave trade first, prior to the abolition of slavery. And so James, in this context, cannot help but take a quick jab at the Brits and at those who present the abolition of the slave trade as driven by these, again, these high-minded kind of moral concerns. The British had been driven out of the US, right? British North America for the most part, not Canada, but out of the US in particular. They had enough slaves already to manage the small Caribbean colonies that they still had, were maintaining. They were turning toward India, and they were finding free trade itself to be immensely profitable. And so the British, according to James, when it's very convenient for them, and also to weaken the French on purpose, to weaken San Domingo, argue suddenly for the abolition of the slave trade. Again, not slavery, the international trade. This happens much, much earlier. And James writes on page 51, with tears rolling down their cheeks for the poor suffering blacks, those British bourgeois who had no West Indian interests set up a great howl for the abolition of the slave trade. They no longer had economic interest in the trade, and so they made a moral crusade against it, right? And then he adds, not just the British who abolish slavery themselves, but what he calls a venal race of scholars, profiteering panders to national vanity, have conspired to obscure the truth about abolition. He'll say things like this over and over again. In other words, this did not happen for moral reasons. Progress in human history does not happen from above, from the powerful, because suddenly they have guilt or feel, have come sort of to see the light about the errors of their ways. That literally never fucking happens for James. He will say very clearly, and he'll say it over and over again in different ways. Most famously, he says, the rich are only defeated when running for their lives. They don't change their mind, right? The opportunism and the hypocrisy of the British claiming that they suddenly saw the light and wanted to abolish the slave trade is precisely because of their economic interest that he's sort of unearthing here. And again, there's a key methodological piece that James is developing out of this, right? Human history does not operate on a moral basis, it operates through strategic struggles, right? On page 55. These then were the forces which in the decade preceding the French Revolution linked San Domingo to the economic destiny of 3 continents in the social and political conflicts of that pregnant age. The 3 forces again were the San Domingo planters, the French bourgeoisie, and the British bourgeoisie. A trade and method of production so cruel and so immoral that it would wilt before the publicity which a great revolution throws upon the sources of wealth. He says something very incredibly Marxist when he says, oh, where is it? With every stride in production, the colony was marching toward its doom. Again, counterintuitive. Wealth is accumulating. It's accumulating faster and faster and faster. And this is like a locomotive that drives it forward that cannot be put in reverse. And in part because it demands a rapid expansion of the labor force. More and more enslaved people are necessary. That means importing more and more. This is a sort of cunning and a lot, cunning of history. Because James has already told us, he says the enormous increase of slaves was filling the colony with native Africans, more resentful, more intractable, more ready for rebellion than the Creole Negro. Of the 500,000 slaves in the colony in 1789, more than 2/3 had been born in Africa. Again, we often use the term now that he doesn't use bozales to refer to this, not only African-born enslaved people, but the political frameworks, mindsets, collective understandings that they often brought with them. There's a political orientation that will develop in the course of the revolution that makes this sector far more radical. And this is 2/3 of the enslaved population. Again, the system itself is demanding the labor, it's pulling it in, it's bringing this sort of threat into the heart of its system. This, James writes, this was San Domingo of 1789, the most profitable colony the most profitable colony the world had ever known. To the casual eye, again, this is the piece about prosperity and accumulation. To the casual eye, the most flourishing and prosperous possession on the face of the globe. To the analyst, in other words, to the Marxist dialectician that he's sort of like, fancying himself at this point, a society torn by inner and outer contradictions, which in 4 years would split that structure into so many pieces that they could never be put together again. Internal contradictions that would split that society into so many pieces they could never be put together again. Paragraph break. Next paragraph. It was the French bourgeoisie who pressed the button. It was the French bourgeoisie who pressed the button. Now, we've already seen when we were talking about the table of contents that it's not exactly the French bourgeoisie who presses the button, unless what he means by the button is something more specific, which is probably true. The chapter titles of the forthcoming chapters 4 and 5, the San Domingo masses begin and the Paris masses complete. Those are based on the revolutionary writer, or the sort of aristocratic writer during the revolutionary period, Chateaubriand, who said it was the patricians who began the revolution and the plebeians who completed it. Meaning the patricians up here, the aristocracy, and the plebeians being the masses. And the question is, why does he mean that it was the patricians who started this bourgeois revolution, in other words, the aristocracy, and how did these events play out? So I just want to give, before we wrap for the day, some basic details. This is a history of the Haitian Revolution in conjunction with and enmeshed with the French Revolution. You all have probably learned more about the French Revolution, but I'll just try to keep you all up on the basic things that happened that are behind these analyses, right? First and foremost, the aristocracy and the monarchy are not the same thing. They're, in fact, in deep conflict at this moment. The monarchy is accumulating power in its own hands. This is the period that we understand as the absolute monarchy, different from just the plain old monarchy. The absolute monarchy, the aristocracy, as a result, is being in some ways dispossessed of some of the power and advantages it might have had previously. Both the bourgeoisie and the aristocracy, in James's words, are proud, exaggeratedly proud. In other words, they have a very high opinion of themselves and what they deserve. The aristocracy for no fucking reason. The bourgeoisie because they're getting rich, right? At least that's a reason. It's not a good reason, but at least it's a reason. The monarchy, though, the crisis is that the monarchy is getting bankrupted, right? The monarchy doesn't have the money to maintain the power that it's got. And in this context, the aristocrats, right, the nobles, those who have inherited authority under the feudal system make a bid for power, right? They start to put pressure on the monarchy for to sort of, in some ways, to regain power that they felt like they had lost. At the same time, this is happening. Peasants across the countryside revolt. And amid all of this, the bourgeoisie would push the button, in James's view, right? What happens concretely is that in response to this fragmentation, in an attempt to sort of reestablish a kind of hegemonic balance of forces, the king convokes the Estates General, right? These are the representatives of the primary sectors of society. It's something that doesn't always exist. It's not like a legislature. The king calls it together, and it's divided into estates. The first two estates represent the nobles and the clergy. The third estate represents the bourgeoisie and the peasantry. That's May 1789. The king says, okay, we have a crisis. Everybody get together in these three estates. They're kind of overweighted. The aristocracy is overrepresentative, of course, because this is a feudal system. In June, in the context of the breakdown of these kind of conversations in the Estates General, where these different groups are supposed to be bringing their concerns, bringing their complaints, it's meant to be a very toothless thing for the king to say, yes, I'm hearing your concerns. The third estate, meaning the representatives of the bourgeoisie and the peasantry, essentially break with the others and walk out. And they declare themselves during the course of June to be the only proper National Assembly. There's a sort of struggle that emerges. A lot of the lower clergy from the Second Estate begin to join them. The National Assembly ends up becoming this sort of undeniable force that's representing, again, the Third Estate, mostly the bourgeoisie and the peasantry, those who have been previously excluded from the system. There's a very famous quote. It's by Sieyès, right? He writes, what is the Third Estate? Everything, right? The true representatives, those who have been excluded from the system. But in the context of this, part of the claim is that they represent the entire nation because they are the excluded, right? But we know that they aren't actually the poorest of the poor, right? We know they aren't the lowest rung of society. They're not what James will call the masses in any sense of the term. This is happening in June. In this context, the colonists from San Domingo, they send representatives from their sort of solidarity club of sort of slavers over in Paris, and they demand representation in this new National Assembly. What's very interesting that happens here is that they're demanding exactly what planters in the US South demanded, which is full representation for the whole population of San Domingo based on population, despite the fact that most of that population is not granted any kind of rights or even seen as sort of human, right? So there is, as James puts it, for the first time, kind of accidentally put onto the sort of floor of the National Assembly in Paris, the fact that there's something going on that is, that is sort of unjust, right? They want 18 representatives in this new National Assembly. They say, this is the population, what is it, 600,000, we deserve 18 representatives. And Mirabeau, this sort of thinker who will become important, for the revolution, then says, but if only a small portion are free, then you should only have 6 representatives, right? But the importance for James is that slavery had been put onto the floor, that the over-representation that the slavers attempted in San Domingo and as they did in the US South, the 3/5 compromise is an expression of this in the US, becomes central, right? That's in June. In July, the masses enter history. If we turn over to the last page of the chapter. The king had been preparing to disperse the Constituent Assembly by force, and the Paris masses, arming themselves, had stormed the Bastille as the symbol of feudal reaction. The Great French Revolution had begun. The Great French Revolution had begun, and it began not when the bourgeoisie claimed or demanded total power in a new National Assembly in the Third Estate. It began when the masses entered history. As James will often say, the masses take history into their own hands. Again, who are the masses? They're the poor. They're the early representation of what we would call a proletariat, but this is before Marx is writing about there being an industrial proletariat, right? The proto-proletariat, the early proletariat, the workers, the poor, the street people, the dispossessed, what is often referred to as the sans-culottes, which means literally, it means like pantsless, or, but, meant to be like you're sort of living in rags without, a great deal of wealth. The sans-culotte, as a revolutionary expression of the Parisian masses, will become a key actor for James. The masses, not the bourgeoisie, will become the key driving force, even within France, of this bourgeois revolution. And on the other side, of course, the masses have not even come into play. Cool. That takes us to the end of the chapter on the owners and the beginning, again, what James calls the beginning of the Great French Revolution. Next week, we'll talk about parliament and property. I don't know, are we doing 2 chapters next week? I forget, but it's on the agenda. We might be doing 2. What do folks have for questions? We have a few minutes still.
I guess one difference I'm observing with Haiti and the U.S. is that they lack a lot of political power within their system. Like the U.S. South can represent itself within the U.S. government, while Haiti exists within this mercantile system. And does that dynamic, aside from giving the opportunity for a revolution, change the class dynamic in the island?
Sorry, what was the very last part?
Like, does that outside dynamic imposed on the island alter the class dynamic that's going on within? As it changes how everyone has to relate with each other existing in a mercantile system.
Yes, 100%. And by mercantile, we're talking about the fact that, one of the main, again, we've mentioned it'll become important, one of the main limitations of the planters in San Domingo is they're locked into what's called the exclusive. This is not free trade. This is when they produce something, they are required to sell it directly to France. Of course, there's lots of, piracy, there's lots of smuggling. These are all happening, but legally, it's required to go to France. This is what upsets the large planters more than anything, because they can't just sell to the US or just sell to other sort of colonial powers. The point, of course, for the French is to keep all the wealth within their pockets, but this is something that will be a primary motivator for the large planters. Now, in terms of political power, yes, I mean, it's the mercantile relationship, but it's also other pieces. One is the demographic imbalance, right? You said, in the US South, the majority of the population was white, and that entire population, again, in Du Bois, in his famous phrase, says the entire white population was the police. The entire white population, played the role and could play the role of policing Black insurgency and preventing slave rebellion. That is a material reality that determines and is a form of political control, right? Because they don't have to engage in the same kinds of, alliances that you're going to see very chaotically emerge here, where the planters are a very small class. The bureaucracy is even smaller, so they have to kind of jockey between these positions, and guess what? They're going to start allying themselves with mixed race people because they need to ally themselves with someone. That's a very, very different dynamic than what happens in the US South. Now, similar contingencies happen in the US South. The overrepresentation is still a huge part of where that political power is anchored, right? By claiming the entirety of the population as representation, a huge part, and you probably know this, of why the Civil War even emerges is a struggle for political dominance over the national system, right? By claiming all enslaved people in the US South, the Southern planters were able to disenfranchise huge numbers of people in the South, including poor white people, and make their power predominant on a national level. That is the kind of balance of forces that San Domingo planters cannot establish, right? Their constraints are much higher. They have the backing of the French government when it comes to resistance, but that's a different kind of backing, as you already noted.
All right, so we have a question in the chat, or 2 questions really. Did Williams, going back to Williams from earlier, build on James' critique of abolitionist narratives, or take it in a new direction? And then following that, and what, if any, were the consequences of this line of thinking on Caribbean independence movements?
I don't know. I think that's up to the interpreter. I think if you read Williams, if you read Capitalism and Slavery, it looks very much like what James is framing out. Again, it looks very much like what someone like Rodney will argue. So I don't think in that, at least, we're talking about a huge shift of direction, because the point being, you're understanding the centrality of slavery, how it provides an anchor for the emergence of capitalism on a global scale, right? It's not just so-called primitive accumulation as an accelerant, but as the center and the core of expanding capitalism to being a global system. And part of what Marx also doesn't map out are the consequences of that system for what's happening in the so-called colonies, right? So Marx is very concerned with how primitive accumulation, meaning slavery and colonialism, use force and violence to, on the one hand, develop and create a working class within Europe through the great enclosures, the proletarianization of former peasants and feudal kind of serfs, are forced off the land and to become a proletariat, to go then be forced by police and violence into the factories, right? That's one piece. The other piece is the wealth that comes from colonialism and slavery into the pockets of the bourgeoisie. That's a piece of what James is talking about, the wealth coming in, the fact that that is then funding the development of capitalism, speeding it up infinitely. It never would have emerged as a global system with the speed that it did without that wealth, but he's not talking about what's then happening on the other side of the colonial equation, right? What is happening to the, again, displacement of communities, new forms of ongoing primitive accumulation, destruction of collective life, and the permanence and ongoing existence of those collective forms of life. Like, there's a whole bunch of things happening that Marx is not, fully accounting for, even though he points us in that direction. What was the second piece? One was about Williams. The second one was about, I've got it, Caribbean liberation movements. Yeah, what is the implication for Caribbean liberation movements? Again, we talked in week 1 about the fact that James didn't write this book for the Caribbean. It was very interesting, right? In 1963, he writes the appendix. That's just a bit of a sort of, recap of the things that we already said. He writes the appendix to do for the Caribbean what he had done in Black Jacobins for Africa. He wrote this book for Africa, for African liberation, African anti-colonial movements, and he himself has a very peculiar relationship to the Caribbean, right? He's from Trinidad, which is a very peculiar kind of colony, in which race exists in very complicated ways, even more complicated than things we've been already sort of describing, because you've got not only a Black population, but also an indentured Indian population that's imported by the British sort of empire. So very complicated. And it's a sort of society where the colonial education is so thick that, he didn't really understand himself as being part of this Caribbean trajectory of struggle until later, right? Building through this understanding of the Haitian Revolution into really approaching the question in the appendix that he adds in 1963 of why are there so many revolutionaries in the Caribbean? Why are there so many great revolutionaries from the Caribbean? Garvey, he's talking about folks that he interacted with in London as well, Césaire, Fanon, all of these great trajectories right up to Fidel Castro, as he puts it. What's going on in the Caribbean? What is it about that sort of, and here we've got not just the centrality of, slavery and the plantation to capitalism, but like the fact that it's the literal center and sort of crossroads of modernity, right? Of where all these things are happening, right? The colonial encounter is happening here. Plantation slavery is developing here. It's become a defining force, and it's a place where, as he puts it, there's lots of mobility, connection. The dynamics, again, are kind of difficult to even map. The Haitian Revolution is happening. We're talking about this, 1791 to 1804, and then people are fleeing, right? Former slave owners are fleeing to the US South, to New Orleans. The Haitian Revolution is causing, by virtue of the damage it does to the French Empire, it forces the Louisiana Purchase. So then, Louisiana and the rest of the purchase occurs because of what the slaves are doing in Haiti. And then people are coming to find shelter in that revolution, right? Simon Bolivar, for example, and others who then go back and help to liberate the northern part of South America. And people are being inspired by this sort of like, again, this kind of pinballing across what is a very compressed space of islands. And islands are key for James, right? Communication on them is very easy. Communication between them is very easy. And so it's very hard to sort of mark a hard line or cut off a dynamic relationship between and among a space like the Caribbean. So these are some of the things that he's identifying as explanations of why the Caribbean revolutionary tradition is a thing. And again, finally, the Caribbean Revolution is part of the Latin American revolutionary tradition. Haiti's part of Latin America, the Caribbean's part of Latin America, and we can't lose that broader frame as well. What else? Jelly.
Yeah, I wanted to like mention that like reading this chapter made me think about like sanctions, right? So like
Yeah.
like white people having beef with each other, right? Being like about power and the economics, and and I think about like the sanctions in the Caribbean, in Latin America, with Venezuela and Cuba. Like not being able to like develop like their own revolutions in that. But I guess like for this context, it's just like how can you elaborate like sanctions and like what we just see now in like the Bolivarian Revolution and the Cuban Revolution. That is literally like the revolutions are maintained by the masses, are maintained by grassroots. Yeah.
Yeah. Again, I could talk about this forever, you know that. Just for folks that weren't in the first session, when James wrote this book, his model was Trotsky's History of the Russian Revolution. When I wrote my first book on Venezuela, this was my model for how to write the history of a revolution, right? And so, and that was both sort of cause and effect in the sense that I looked to it and saw an explanation of what was actually happening, meaning the role of the masses, the driving force between these revolutions. There's so much more though to say, right? Again, we think about that history, think about the dynamic of Bolivar being given shelter in Haiti. And even then, Pétion, the Haitian president, says, I'm going to support you, I'm going to give you weapons, I'm going to give you refuge, and you need to go back and liberate the slaves in the Gran Colombia, right? Just the northern part of South America. Bolivar doesn't really exactly do that, right? Bolivar is a liberator, but he's a liberator somewhere between Toussaint and Lincoln, right? Not as bad as Lincoln, not as good as Toussaint. And I say that because he was himself very worried and fearful of what he called the pardocracia, right? The rule of non-whites. All of the white Creole elites in Latin America were very concerned about giving mixed race people too much power. Bolivar was no exception, so he hesitated a great deal. And he didn't. There's a very interesting dynamic that's very similar to what's happening here with the contingencies of struggle and the needs for alliances, which is that it's not until he is losing in the war that he frees enslaved people. And he's losing because the other side, apparently the side of the Spanish, but in reality under the leadership of this caudillo, who you probably know, named Boves. It's not until Boves is freeing enslaved people and telling them they can wreak havoc and enact vengeance on the whites that Bolivar says, well, I guess I better free the slaves, right? Because of this other threat, this bigger threat. That's a dynamic that happens all the time, right? The civil rights movement, right? The civil rights movement succeeds when the bigger threat emerges, right? You've got the sort of the pressure, the material pressure of the second force that makes the more palatable force acceptable, right? So again, that's to say, Bolivar, we don't necessarily need to interpret him as someone who's driven solely by high-minded moral principles, although that can also be there, but by the requirements of struggle. The requirements of struggle emerge in such a way that he is forced to free enslaved people. Boves, this great caudillo, royalist caudillo, who is unleashing the vengeance of the Black and indigenous masses in Venezuela, still strikes fear into the heart of right-wing Venezuelans today. Like they still think about this person. They also, there were all, at the time, permanent references to fear of there being a new Haiti, right? So the Haitian Revolution is also something that is incredibly frightening. Now, you were talking about sanctions. Sanctions, as we understand them, of course, are, part of what's often referred to as hybrid warfare, right? Not direct warfare, but hybrid warfare, a mix of tactics used to weaken and undermine any government that we don't agree with. This is long-standing, and the tactics are many. Under Bush 1, there was a coup against Chavez that overthrew him for 48 hours. The key that Jelly is really identifying is that that coup was overthrown, reversed. How often do you see a coup reversed? That coup was reversed because hundreds of thousands of people took to the streets, right, the masses, and defied this coup and forced the return of Chavez to power and the Constitution, right, that they had helped to write. So that happens under Bush. In other words, there's an open attempt to overthrow the government. The US government is directly implicated and involved. Nothing really changes under Obama. Under Obama, Hillary Clinton is the Secretary of State. She's encouraging coups in Honduras that lead to brutal death squads. They're encouraging continued aggression against Venezuela, which takes different forms, funding the opposition, trying desperately to find someone who could beat Chavez in a democratic election, not a very easy thing to do. And so they're trying, this is all part of the hybrid warfare, right? You're using all of these different techniques, you're sanctioning, you're trying to, punish the economy. And it's really under Obama that the sanctions take off, right? It's not under Trump, it's under Obama, right? Obama sets up the sanctions regime that throws the Venezuelan economy into chaos, and Trump then amplifies it. So it's a bipartisan effort to use these sanctions. Now, the last thing I'll say is that we talk about sanctions, but the operative category for the history of Haiti is reparations, right? And I don't mean good reparations. I mean the reparations that Haiti was required to pay to France, that numbered in the trillions and tens of trillions of dollars, right? So for having the temerity to overthrow the government and steal the property of the French, meaning the human property, Haiti was saddled with a brutally devastating sanctions regime for a century, right? And that, of course, is on top of direct interventions, direct overthrow of popular governments, which we know, and we could name the popular Haitian leaders that have been overthrown. And, all of this is to say that the propaganda narrative that James is trying to counteract from the very beginning, namely that Africa was a backwards place and that people were lucky that the civilizing force of the enslavers showed up to bring them into civilization. That's the kind of narrative that capitalism and colonialism and slavery thrive upon, right? Because that's the same narrative that says the Haitians can't govern themselves. You destroy their ability to self-govern during the course of more than a century, and then you say they can't govern themselves, right? It's an ongoing propaganda project.
Okay. So we have another question in the chat that says, given the material/economic beef between France and Britain at this time, are there noted familial/monarchy beef that fueled their economic divisions? Post-European empires such as Roman, Spanish, and Ottoman empires as well.
So is the causal question, the causal arrow being, are there familial beefs that fuel the economic beefs? Oh, I think it's the opposite, right? I mean, it's the material beefs, right? And we know perfectly well that these are families that are not bound to nation states, let's just put it that way. These are transnational incestuous networks where you're being sold off into marriage in Austria or in Italy or in England. There's no boundary to this. And this is a long-standing, practice, right? So the national economic interest is in no way bound to the interest of the familial clans or relationships that they're developing, right? And the reason we know this super well is because, we'll see this in the next couple of chapters, when the revolution begins, when the monarchy is besieged, what does Louis do? He turns outside of the country. He looks for help from reactionaries across the continent and engages in what is justifiably seen as treason, right? There's a war going on, and the king is looking for support in different countries from reactionary armies, right? Because for the king, the struggle is actually, it's not solely economic, right? Actually, to be really clear about it, it's not simply economic because he's a representative not of the bourgeoisie, but of the absolutist monarchy, right? It's a struggle between reaction and liberalism, right? The war that the king, that Louis sees as necessary to be fought is that he needs the forces of absolutist monarchy on a transnational basis to come to his aid to reinstate something like the power of that monarchy, right? And this will lead to very interesting correlations of forces, projects, dynamics, counterintuitive combinations, like someone like Napoleon, who was a liberal warlord, right? He's riding across Europe to overthrow, as an emperor, to overthrow absolutist monarchies. It's a sort of very bizarre configuration, but it comes out of this moment, right? So yes, the family units are absolutely permeable in many different ways. The defining forces are an attachment to sort of absolutism for the reactionaries and an attachment to capitalist wealth for the bourgeoisie on a transnational basis as well. Now, I don't need to add any more. We can take more questions, but the bourgeoisie are more divided by nation. Let's just put it that way. They're more inter-imperialist competition because of the way that the state plays a role in determining, how commerce is happening and how competition happens. What else? We can take a couple more maybe, but we're running a little late. Cool. One more in the chat.
So we have a question in the chat that says, how is the ruling class able to learn from what happened in Haiti and maintain control of the people and the system in the future? So essentially, how a ruling class is able to profit and learn from these revolutions in the same way that other oppressed peoples were.
It doesn't say which ruling class, right?
No.
Yeah, because you can interpret it in different ways, right? Normally the question would be posed on a national basis again. The ruling class, say like, what is the Haitian emergence of a new ruling class learn from this? That's not the question. The question is the transnational class, which is on the one hand a class that's still dedicated to slavery and also dedicated to capitalism, right? So there are lots of different pieces you could read into this question. It's very interesting, right? Concretely, what happens, right? Concretely, I've already mentioned, planters and slave owners from Haiti flee to Louisiana and elsewhere, but very, very heavily to Louisiana, right? What's very interesting about this sort of, again, the cunning of this dynamic is that they are bringing their own sort of slave owning ideology, which already exists in the US South, but they have a particular form of it. But they're also bringing with them enslaved people who themselves are bringing stories and accounts of the revolution in progress and the possibility of that revolution, right? That is not unrelated to the way that slave rebellions then play out. One not long thereafter in Louisiana, right? Leading up to things like Nat Turner 1831, right? That's only a couple decades later. So there's a few things happening, and the question is, what is the ruling class learning? You're like, shit, did they learn anything? Because there's this, the Southern US ruling class. I talk a lot about this in the Anti-Colonial Eruptions book, which builds on that volcanic metaphor piece. But there's this sort of bizarre attempt to manage what I call the cognitive dissonance of the slave system in the US South, which is based on the idea that slavery is a sort of beneficent patriarchal system in which you're all one big family, and the knowledge that there's resistance and rebellions happening, and the fear. Again, it's a cognitive dissonance because you're telling yourself that the people that you are enslaving are happy, but you know they shouldn't be happy. And you know that they're also showing signs of being unhappy, like resisting, like the Haitian Revolution. And so every time one of these moments happens where enslaved people rise up and struggle, and so slave masters can no longer deny that it's possible, they have to try to explain it away, right? So they do things like they don't talk about it. Silence is the first strategy. It's almost a proscription. Don't talk about slave revolts. Secondly, they double down on the narrative. So this narrative that slavery is a kind system gets more important as it enters into crisis. Again, this makes sense when you think about it that way, right? They need to justify and legitimize the system. So that's one of the strategies. But you have this sort of dynamic where then the rebellions are continuing. There's this attempt to explain this, and it's like someone must be riling them up, right? You've got the outside agitators, or you've got the sort of outside influences. And all of these begin to sort of play into this kind of crisis of the slave system. They'll have trials for insurrections, which are the most interesting things because you're putting someone on trial that you say has no legal standing as a human to be held responsible for what they do, and yet you're putting them on trial, which is to admit that they are responsible for the things that they do, right? So this contradiction is really one that the US South is not able to get over. And so what did they learn? Nothing. They learned some like containment strategies. Their job is a little easier, certainly a lot easier than in San Domingo and in Haiti, right? Because of the demographic imbalance and the different sort of balances of powers. This is the story that Du Bois tells. And it's a story of the impossibility, I think, of really learning what it would take to stabilize a system that can't be stabilized. Cool. Thank you all so much. That was amazing. Thank you for being here. Thanks to everyone in the room. Thanks to everyone on the stream. Next week, we will dig into the parliament and property.